Ever wondered how children really learn in their early years? What sparks their curiosity and what engages them? Foundational years are not just about learning letters and numbers. They are the building blocks for all future learning. For over a decade, Language and Learning Foundation has worked to strengthen foundational learning through effective classroom practices and system strengthening initiatives. Drawing on this experience, we bring to you LLF Speaks Season 2, a 10-episode podcast series where we engage with global and national voices to explore crucial subjects, contributing to improving FLN outcomes. Stay tuned to deep dive on how to do FLN, conversations on building foundational learning at scale.
Welcome to LLF Speaks. In this episode, we focus on a key question. How do we make equitable foundational learning work at scale? While nearly all of India's children are enrolled in primary years now with expanded school access, not all of them are learning. The recent national learning assessments such as ASAR and Parak have indicated that since the launch of Nipun Bharat in July 2021, there has been improvement in the learning levels of children, especially among those who are in rural government schools. However, not all children are learning. This is a matter of grave concern, and many of these children are still being left behind out of our purview of what is working. This national average often hides the huge variance in learning across states, similarly across learning levels across districts, and even within the same school. If FLN efforts are to reach every child, we need to ask, how do we design the foundational learning programs that are equitable from the beginning? And to discuss this today, I'm joined by Sunisha Ahuja to talk about classrooms and systems and how they need to be designed to respond to barriers of learning faced by children across geographies and social groups. Sunisha is the Director of Equity at Language and Learning Foundation, previously worked with UNICEF and other nonprofits such as Room to Read and Mobile Creches. She was the Chief Consultant at the Ministry of Education and Government of India and has provided technical guidance to states for the implementation of Sarva Shiksha Abhiyan. She brings a wide experience of over 30 years in early learning. Sunisha, thank you for joining us. To begin with, I would like to ask, who are the children that are getting left behind and not attaining foundational literacy and numeracy skills? Also, what does the data tell us?
Thank you, Shaiza. And I think this is such an important conversation to have today when we seeing that the national assessments are telling us that the learning losses that were induced due to long school closure during the pandemic, children have started to come out of that learning loss that we noticed in 2021. But like you just said, there are deeper challenges that are still there. Particularly in mathematics, there are gender gaps that we see in the learning outcomes that children are achieving. You refer to the ASAR data. The class 3 students in government schools could read a class 2 level text, and this improved from 16.3% in 2022 to 23.4% in 2024. Class 3 students were able to do a subtraction that too increased from 28.1% to 33.7% in 2024. So definitely something is working since Nipun Bharat got launched. But these averages, they're really concealing some real deep challenges that we have of learning that are happening in classrooms. There is a district that could be above average, but if you dig deeper into the data, you will find that there will be about 1/3 children who are not really learning at that average score level also. So children are struggling, and global and national reports have highlighted that these inequities on FLN, these are strongly correlated to gender, location, socio-economic status, and especially with marginalized group consistently are hardest to hit. And if I were to say the critical question that we should be really now asking all of ourselves and the system should be asking is, whose scores are improving, which are the children who are not learning. And evidence has suggested that children in low performing states are hardest hit. They are the children who are not really learning. And this is, the performance gaps between states that are performing the best and the states that are performing the lowest. The data is actually showing the gaps are widening, which is a big concern. And much of this is because of the kind of cumulated effects of the policies that these states have adopted, which could be around language of instruction, it could be about investment of resources, teacher training, community engagement that happens. The other important group that we have to think about of children who are not learning are the children from tribal communities. Imagine a 6-year-old walking into a classroom and being addressed in a language or being provided a textbook in a language that the child has no familiarity with. The context of the textbooks does not represent the local culture of that child. So it's the tribal children who, from over the years, as we have seen our learning assessment data, even the government learning assessment data, the what was earlier called the National Achievement Survey, now is called Parak. If you look at the trends for the last 3 rounds, children from tribal communities have consistently performed low, and language is a big barrier that these children face. A third group, and which I think is intersectional, it's the girls across these communities. They face a compounding disadvantage. One, at the home level, the girls do not get enough time to learn. They don't perhaps get enough support to learn. Even inside the classrooms, teachers have their biases about how much girls can learn or which subjects girls can do well in. And that kind of, then leads to less practice time for the girls. It leads to girls not getting enough opportunities. So everything becomes less and less for them. A third group of children that I would highlight here is children from migrating families. These children don't exist in any database. There are no learning assessments being done for these children. These children, because of the migration pattern of their families, they actually miss out on schooling, and could be extended periods of time that these children are not there. And when they come back, the school does not have a mechanism of helping them catch up because the curriculum has moved on. As India urbanizes more and migration increases, children living in urban slums are really facing a lot of challenges. Imagine a child who's speaking Bhojpuri at home or Bengali at home, comes to Delhi, is in a school which is a Hindi medium school. How does that child get supported to learn? And these are things that are leading to those, inequities in learning. I cannot complete this conversation without bringing up children with disabilities. They're not even covered in any of our assessments. If you look at enrollments for children with disabilities, their presence in schools is much lower than their presence in the population. A lot needs to be done for children with disabilities. And one of the last things that I feel that we really need to be considering is we still have a lot of children who are first generation learners. These are children where parents have not been to school. There is no preparation for this child to go to school. The home may not have any print rich material or books. So the rhythms of going to school and learning in school or being supported at home to learn are things that are missing. And this category could be cut across all those earlier categories that I talked about. So I think when we are thinking about who are these children who are not learning, we really need to think about, all these different groups of children, and the system will, need to kind of plan and design for all these children.
Right. I think it's very important how you mentioned that there are intersecting identities for children. So specifically when we think about why they may not be learning, do you think it's just because of their intersecting identities, or is there more to that?
So, like I said, one group of children that are not learning are the children from tribal communities. And therefore, the issue of language, the language of instruction, the language that's used for teaching learning in the classroom is so critical. Historically, we've not had very clear policy guidelines on what should be the language of instruction that should, to use children's familiar language as the language of instruction in schools. And we all know there is enough evidence to show today that when the classroom recognizes a child's language as the language of instruction, it not only makes the child comfortable in that classroom environment, but it increases their engagement in learning. I've seen it for myself in classrooms in Rajasthan, in Dungarpur, where the moment we started to talk to children in Wagdi, the teacher was talking to the children in Wagdi, the learning materials was in Wagdi, and it was perfectly fine for children to respond to a teacher using mixed language. So they were speaking in Wagdi, they were speaking in Hindi. The whole classroom learning environment changed. The second barrier, I would say, is around how we design our programs. We often design our programs keeping in mind an average child, child coming from a very stable family, whose life is predictable, uninterrupted. But there are a significant proportion of children, like I said earlier, who are from migrating families, who are from single parent families, or a grandparent, both parents are not there. A child whose family is on the move all the time. So learning gets disrupted. So, and often what happens is, because the system is not responding to these challenges, we end up saying that the child is disengaged. So the problem is not that the child is disengaged. The challenge is that we have not really thought about how to keep this child engaged. And last but not the least, I would say the belief system of the entire system, but really of that teacher in the classroom. And I'm not saying that from criticizing a teacher, but I think teachers are also human beings. We all have biases, assumptions, and somehow our teacher professional development programs, they do not address these biases. Biases about girls may not do well in mathematics, which is a very common bias that we have seen come out in our conversations. LLF in December 2025 launched the Teaching Learning Practices Survey, one of the largest first national study that took place, which is across 1,000 classrooms. And what is really sad to see from that data, that 43% of the teachers actually had this belief that the children who are struggling to learn in their classrooms will never attain foundational skills. And I think this influences their classroom teaching practices. So, choral repetition that we see in the classroom. Now, it's a very inequitable pedagogical approach that is there in the classroom, because one child will get up and answer the question, or all children will repeat. So the child who does not even know is just moving her lips, and the teacher thinks that this child knows. So these children are becoming invisible in the classroom. Copying from the board. Now, there's no thinking involved in it. Some children will do it, others will not do it, and therefore the teacher will not really focus on the child who's not learning. So there are many such practices. And, the TLPS survey, it found that 70% of the teachers knew children's languages, but they were not using them in the classroom. Now, if children are not engaged in the learning process, they're not going to be able to learn. And that's central to ensuring that we have an equitable classroom.
Thanks for that, Sunisha. I think it's very important what you mentioned, that it's not just where the child is coming from or their social identity, but also how the system is responding to it. And more importantly, how even the classroom is responding to it as well. In fact, this is reminding me of a small study we did in Chandauli in Uttar Pradesh, where we tried to diagnose almost what teachers' beliefs and attitudes were about children and their learning. And the findings were very similar to TLPS, where many teachers did not actually believe that all children have the same capacity to learn, or even believe that they would be able to acquire the foundational skills if given the right support at the right time. And with that kind of finding, we were almost forced to innovate into our training that we were planning inside that pilot. And we did experience that with the attitudinal input, there were positive shifts in the teachers. And in fact, we are hoping that we would be able to use that finding at a larger scale, so that it can inform the system and it can inform other districts where LLF works as well. But it's bringing a question to my mind, which is, how do you think professional development for teachers, but also for other stakeholders in the system? So let's say your mid-tiers, the ARPs, the SRGs, how do you think they would be able to, what kind of capacity building should we do to help them address learning equity barriers a bit more effectively inside the classroom, but also at a systemic level?
Yeah. No, I think the program that you're referring to in Chandoli, I think that will really have immense learning for LLF's programs, and should be taken to scale, given that now we'll have some more data on the kind of shifts that have happened at the teacher's knowledge, attitude, practice level. And so that project really offers us immense learning, and I think we should take that as we work with the state governments in designing training programs. And if I remember from what you've shared with me earlier, Shaiza, I think what has perhaps worked in those training programs is been that the training has been more reflective. The teachers have not been given solutions. So I think often we are in this process of trying to give quick solutions. And I think that then also gets reflected in the classrooms, how teachers deal with children. One of the things that is often said, teachers giving thinking time to children to think of the answer and then respond. And if they don't get that opportunity in their training programs, then how do they even go and practice something that they've not experienced? So the other thing is, training programs will have to be more experiential. And examples in those training programs will have to come from that local context. The life of a child from that village where the teacher is teaching. And if teachers are if teachers get to see the change that happens in a child who they thought is never going to be able to learn, can be the biggest winner for us in terms of, getting teachers to believe that this can happen, change can happen. I think at a content level, we do need to build teachers' capacities on how to use children's home languages in a bilingual context, so that there is space for children's languages inside the classroom, not only for just everyday communication, but for formal teaching, learning, as well as assessments. And I think that's something that we have to still figure out, that how do you do multilingual assessments of children. Teachers also, I'm sure you've seen, teachers need to understand how to do differentiated teaching inside the classroom. How do you form groups, peer group learning? How do you do mixed level groups? How do you do same level groups? How do you design an activity for children in such groups? I think these are some things that need to be transacted as part of the training programs. We've been focusing a lot on the content, the structured pedagogy, the 4-block approach, all of that. We've really I think that's something that teachers have now started to register in their heads. But I think we're still not doing enough conversations around classroom management for the teacher to keep an eye on who's the child who's not responding in my class. What are children sitting in that last row doing while I am explaining something. I think these are some of those tips that we have to start giving to the teachers. And since you also talked about other stakeholders, they are very important for LLF's program. We've been focusing now on the mid-tier, the BEOs, the DEOs, the CRCs or the ARPs, whatever name they are called in different states, the academic resource kind of cadre of people. I think as part of their capacity building, what we really need to bring home to them is that when they go to a school, they're not just asking a teacher how much curriculum has been covered. They should really be asking who are the children who are not being able to keep pace with the way the curriculum is progressing. So, every conversation, whether it is a teacher training program, whether it is a professional learning community of teachers, whether it is a on site support visit of an academic resource person, I think the question needs to change now. And for that, I think we need to say that focus on those children who are not learning, and don't focus on how much content has been transacted. And if we shift this conversation, I think it's that adage that whatever gets measured gets done. So far we were measuring whether teachers are using teacher guides. I think now we have to shift that and say which are the children who are not learning, how many children are not learning in the classroom.
On the topic of reflection as a skill, it's reminding me how teachers have often come back to us, again in the same study, with supportive structures of professional learning communities, like you mentioned, that they really liked. We did not give them inputs, and they really liked that we gave them the space to think and brainstorm with each other. And it's really making me think about what you said, right? What gets measured will get done. Maybe teachers have also been burdened by the excessive amount of data that gets collected inside the classroom. And because we are only collecting one kind of data, they're also only doing one kind of teaching that they feel will lead to success in that data metric. But if we start measuring things like how much wait time did you give to the child, or were children only copying from the board, or were they doing creative writing, maybe those questions changing will also change how the classrooms look. And in fact, one of the TLPS findings that you mentioned, where teachers knew the home language or the most familiar language of a child, but were not able to use it in the classroom or were not using it, it really makes us think that oftentimes maybe teachers are aware that it would help, but they don't know what's the strategy to use in the classroom. How do I actually break down a literacy concept using a bilingual strategy? So I think professional development programs, especially for teachers, have a long way to go for sure. In our deep dive and immersive audit of the training programs, we also felt that teachers are now more and more curious, especially after structured pedagogy. They are now beginning to acknowledge that yes, some structure is helpful, and now they want to know more. So it's up to the ecosystem now to respond to that need as well.
Yeah. In fact, I would say that to the academic mentors and to the mid-tier, I think we'll have to also help them and give them certain tools that then direct them to start seeing other things inside the classroom. So probably the classroom observation tools need to change. And if the classroom observation tools change, it will change the conversation that happens between the academic mentor and the teacher. So I think we'll also have to look at these kind of tools that are shared with people who visit schools.
And I think the tools bring me to another important question in my mind, which was how do we actually even ensure that equity remains a focus when we are designing programs, especially for at scale? So, for example, if a state wants to do FLN well and wants to do it well for all children, is there a sure shot formula to what should be done? Or are there clear frameworks of how do we make sure that these designs are going to reach all children in the state?
So like I've been saying in my previous responses as well, is I think this whole change or shift will happen if we start with recognizing and focusing on children who need that additional support. I think that is somewhere a non-negotiable for us. because India's data, we collect a lot of data, but we are very good at calculating averages. And I think now the narrative has to shift beyond averages. It's children that we'll have to track based on gender, social groups, where they are based, what kind of school do they attend, what is the language of instruction, their parental background, their family backgrounds, literacy levels there. And I think now we cannot think of looking at small increments of change. We'll have to really design our programs for making a bigger leap, because and this can only come once we start understanding the children who are not learning, and we spend some time in understanding what are the difficulties because of which they are not learning. So for example, groups of families that migrate, and they migrate for a significant amount of time during the academic year. When these children come back, the school actually has no mechanism of giving these children an opportunity to catch up with the curriculum that they've missed. And one of our experiences has been of doing these catch up classes for children before they join school back again. We will have to think of these out of the box strategies. And they are not necessarily out of the box strategies. These are things that will have to be planned by the school, because unless we are looking at the key challenges, like I said, language. Now, if 35% of the children are learning in a language that they don't speak and understand, that's leaving a very large number of children out of the learning system. So these are the kind of solutions that we'll have to think of. But this can begin with looking at our data differently, going beyond the averages, looking at the patterns and the shifts that are happening across different databases as well. And I think that might give us a much more nuanced understanding of the problem.
Absolutely. And I think it's important to mention here that while disaggregated data may sound like additional work or additional work for a small minority of children who are not learning, the global research does tell us that if you focus on the children who are not learning, everyone improves. It is a risk that I think we're running in. If we only focus on those who are already improving, eventually learning is going to plateau as well.
I would just add there, I think all of this can happen if the system, everybody in the system starts to believe that every child can learn. And I have a role in ensuring that every child learns. I think this, and linked to this, is a second thing about a very clear vision of when I think of a good classroom, what is that good classroom? Where children are engaged, children are using their own familiar language. Every moment in that classroom is a learning moment for the child. So there's very high time on task. Children are responding. They're engaging with each other. They're engaging with the teacher. I think if we all can agree on a system-wide belief of every child can learn, and a vision of what is a good classroom, I think that's as important as looking at our data.
And I think this understanding that classrooms need to change at scale and having a vision for them is very much a change that's happening in the system as well. So historically, LLF, for example, over the last decade, has been following a twin track approach of making equity considerations, making sure that context-specific challenges, like you mentioned, migration or language mismatch, are addressed, but also context-agnostic challenges, like maybe teaching learning practices need to improve and more contextual attitudinal training needs to be done, or multi-level teaching needs to happen. Those are also changes that LLF is trying to implement with the systems at scale. I think looking to the future, Sunisha, as systems try to scale this further, what steps do you think LLF is planning to take to ensure FLN is actually becoming more equitable? And what gives you the hope that it is actually possible?
So I would say, we are almost completing the first 5 years of Nipun Bharat. And like I said in the beginning, in this first 5 years or the first wave of FLN, I think the whole idea was to get the design right, use more evidence based approaches. And we've done that very well, both as LLF in supporting governments to embed these evidence based approaches, adopting structured pedagogy, using a 4 block approach of focus a lot more on oral language development than ever before. And we are seeing the fruits of it in terms of, we've been able to turn the tide on the low learning levels of children. But I think moving forward, if I may want to call it like the second wave of FLN, we will really have to now shift our conversations around who are the children who are not learning and why they are not learning. And therefore, design our programs with enough flexibility for the teacher to be able to address the needs of children who need additional support. Like I said earlier, our programs cannot be designed for the average child. Our programs need to be a little, more comprehensive in order to be able to cater to all different groups of children. We will really need to focus on multilingual approaches to learning. We will have to get the academic resource people, the mid-tier, to start understanding, and therefore in their approach to the classroom, look at issues of inequity in the classroom. Identify those children who are not participating in the class, identify their problems, and work with the teacher in terms of addressing it through adapting the teaching learning practices. So these are some of the things that I think will have to be now a priority. Our efforts will be now to embed equity and gender within the system so that every stakeholder of the system owns this issue and is willing to participate in making a shift towards making sure that every child learns.
Right. And what do you think the role of evidence is? Do we have enough evidence in India? Is LLF planning to generate more evidence?
So I think apart from looking at secondary data analysis, I think qualitative studies to look at and understand deeper the different contexts which lead to children not being able to learn, which could be both school related factors but outside the school factors. So LLF is now pursuing a study called the Learning in the Margins study, which is currently happening in Haryana and Uttar Pradesh. And I'm sure that study will bring out some really nuanced understanding of children's context for what is that barrier that is coming in their way of learning. And we hope to be able to do such similar studies in other contexts as well, because I agree with you, we need more data from within India. And I think the project that you mentioned, the Teacher Professional Development for Equity program in Chandauli, Uttar Pradesh, that's going to give us some good insights. There's work happening on embedding gender responsiveness in classroom. Studies from there will tell us what are those gender related issues that need to be addressed either through teacher professional development, in learning materials, in the classroom transaction. So completely agree. We need more evidence and contribute to everybody's learning and knowledge in the country on why equity is so critical. And only then will we be able to get all children to learn.
And I think what I'm taking away from our conversation is also that we can't have a myopic view of only the teacher and only the classroom. And the entire system's perspective almost needs to shift towards believing all children can learn, and ensuring that systems are put in place, whether it's at the policy level or at the intervention level, to address the barriers that children are facing. And hopefully, Learning in the Margin study will illuminate those barriers as well. Thank you for that insightful conversation, Sunisha. I think just to conclude, I am reiterating and almost acknowledging again that the work that has been done over the last decade in foundational literacy and numeracy reforms has definitely had an impact in the classrooms at scale. But of course, with that realization that after all this time has passed, we're now beginning to realize that it didn't work for all children, and we probably did not reach the last mile. And it really makes us think, me as a practitioner, and I'm sure others in the ecosystem, what will work? And maybe it requires us to allocate more resources, generate more evidence, and think deeply about whether our programs at scale are addressing the challenges for a geography or for a group of social identities. On that note, I think I would like to also share that LLF increasingly over the next 5 years in our strategic approach is beginning to expand its outreach to nonprofit organizations and trying to work with the ecosystem to collaborate on generating evidence. The TLPS was definitely a very collaborative effort with the ecosystem to generate a landscape of teaching learning practices in the country. And of course, the TLPS 2.0 should be on the way soon. Thank you for joining us for this episode, and we hope to see you in the next one.